From New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, this is Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Weston. We start again today with a report on the markets. The markets are off for a second day, this time I think because of China, but you know who's going to tell us? It's going to be Abigail Doolittle. What's going on, Abigail?
You know, David, overall, it's actually a relatively sleepy day. It's sort of surprising because, of course, in the Asian session, we had very big declines for the Hang Seng in Hong Kong. We also had the Shanghai Composite off sharply, the worst day for the Hang Seng since 2015 on the close. Of course, that on that surprise security issue by China on Hong Kong. So really creating a sense of risk off, but it has not traveled to Europe. It has not traveled to the U.S. So right now we have the S&P 500 off just modestly, but where we are seeing some of that increasing tension, that pain for stocks, the FANG index down about 0.9%. The two stocks that are really down there are China ADRs, Baidu and Alibaba. And then we also have a China index of China firms listed here in the U.S. down even sharply, down for a third day in a row, down 3.3% on fears that these tensions, because Hong Kong and that tension with China is really seen as a sign of the tensions also for the U.S., the idea that there's going to be more likelihood that those China firms will be delisted here in the U.S., confirming the risk-off tone that we're seeing for more of those China-sensitive stocks and sectors, areas. We do have bonds rallying just a little bit, but again, just a very small decline for that S&P 500 on the day, David. We are, of course, going into a long weekend, so it feels like a lot of traders have checked out. And on the week, it has been very, very choppy. Great point, 2 down days in a row. But on the week, we are actually looking at a gain of 2.7%. That comes after last week's loss. So that range we've been talking about stays in place with the bulls and the bears duking it out, looking for more information on what could be next for the global economy and how that will play out through the market. Stay tuned. We'll be talking about that next week, of course, David.
Okay, thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle. Well, the National People's Congress has just gotten underway in Beijing, but it's already made a fair amount of news, and the markets have been reacting in Asia, particularly as Abigail just said. We're going to go now to our fellow Bloomberg anchor, Selena Wang, over in Beijing. And Selena, I guess I'd like to start first with the Chinese economy and the fact that they no longer are giving an estimate for future growth. What does that tell us?
David, that's right. This is quite significant because this annual GDP target really serves as a guideline, a cue, a North Star for local officials across the country to really set their own investments in policymaking. So the fact that for the first time in decades they are not giving this number really just shows the depth of the disruption caused by the pandemic. That being said, David, we did get some more specifics in other areas. China said it would be significantly increasing infrastructure investment with a focus on technology through the sale of some $500 billion of special government bonds. In addition to that, they'll be widening that GDP deficit to more than 3.6% of GDP, which is more than in the wake of the global financial crisis. And the really big focus area here that Premier Li Keqiang emphasized is the creation of jobs. They're targeting the creation of 9 million jobs. This is as some 130 million people in China have been laid off or furloughed as a result of the pandemic. And this is critical here because rising wages, more employment has been a key part of the Communist Party's legitimacy.
So as you say, there seems to be a shift from growth to jobs. They have a lot of unemployed. They will have to address that. They've got issues about possible dissension in the ranks if they don't. At the same time, the other piece of news really had to do with Hong Kong and that new security measure that they're implementing. It feels for us over here, Selena, as if Beijing has basically said, if we have to choose between a strong Hong Kong in terms of economy and security, we'll go with security, thank you.
David, that does seem to be the case. It appears that Xi Jinping is really fed up with Hong Kong and will take whatever measures, the tougher line, no matter the consequences here. This is highly controversial, this national security bill. The last time the attempt was to pass this was in 2003, and that led to mass demonstrations in the streets of Hong Kong, and it led to the legislation being shelved. Now, at a time when the rest of the world is really preoccupied with fighting the COVID pandemic, China is signaling that it's going to be passing this bill by circumventing Hong Kong's own legislation. Now, we don't have the text of the law yet, but we are expecting it to ban the sedition, secession, and subversion of the central government in Beijing. While China argues this is key to Hong Kong's security, not allowing any foreign interference in Hong Kong. Opposition leaders say that this fundamentally erodes the independence, judicial autonomy, as well as freedom of expression in Hong Kong. And we are already seeing this very strong reaction from the U.S. as well, with the 2 senators in the U.S. introducing this legislation that would impose sanctions on Chinese officials and entities that are involved in enforcing this bill.
Yeah, there's the issue up on Capitol Hill about possible delisting of some Chinese companies. At the same time, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said today, we're going to take a hard look at whether Hong Kong should retain its special trading status. Does that give Beijing any pause at all? It feels like the situation is deteriorating, even as Premier Li Keqiang said they're going to stay on the path of the trade agreement.
It's a very tricky situation, actually, from the U.S. side. You mentioned Mike Pompeo's comments. The U.S. really has to toe the line between sending a strong message to Beijing while also not undermining the interests of U.S. companies already operating in Hong Kong, because by revoking the special trading status of Hong Kong, that would hurt U.S. companies operating there. Yes, we are seeing this broader spiraling deterioration of relations between the 2 countries in pretty much every single area, whether it's technology, financial flows, potential delisting of companies, as well as human rights, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South China Sea. The one bright spot I want to mention, though, is Premier Li Keqiang saying that China is going to uphold that Phase 1 trade deal. Now, we don't know how realistic it is that China can actually increase purchases of U.S. goods by more than $200 billion over the course of 2 years, given the state of the global economy and both of these domestic economies. But you do at least have this one thin thread of cooperation between these 2 countries amid the broader deterioration, because, David, quite frankly, neither country has an incentive to restart a tariff war given this global economic situation.
Yeah, not with the recession we're all in. That's exactly right. Thank you so much to Selena Wang. She's our fellow Bloomberg anchor reporting from Beijing. Coming up here, we're going to talk about education in the time of the pandemic. Arne Duncan, former Secretary of Education, will be joining us to talk to us about remote learning. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We go now to Karina Mitchell for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, anti-malaria drugs that President Trump has touted for treatment of COVID-19 were linked to an increased risk of death and heart ailments in a study. The research was published today by the Lancet Medical Journal. It found hydroxychloroquine didn't help patients with the coronavirus, and it found a higher risk of death when taken with certain other antibiotics. Trump's endorsement has led many people to take the medications without scientific proof of their benefit. Meanwhile, India is reporting a big jump in virus cases. More than 6,000 new ones were reported in the past 24 hours, the biggest single-day spike since the pandemic began. India now has more than 118,000 cases and 3,500 deaths. India's eased its nationwide lockdown to restart economic activities. And Russian President Vladimir Putin is returning his focus to hold on to power. Thrown off course by the coronavirus pandemic over the past couple of months, Putin is now moving to regain the political initiative for his plan to remain as Russia's president potentially until 2036. Sources tell Bloomberg that Putin may announce a snap ballot within weeks on proposed changes to the constitution that allow him to sidestep term limits. Putin said today the virus situation in Russia has stabilized. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Karina Mitchell. This is Bloomberg. David.
Thanks so much, Karina. Well, adults are having a hard enough time adjusting to this stay-at-home business, but what about our school children? How are they coping? We turn now to a true education expert. He is Arne Duncan. He's managing partner of Emerson Collective, but of course, he was Secretary of Education under President Barack Obama. Arne, thank you so much for being back with us. We've had about, 2 months plus of experience here. Do we have a sense of how this remote learning is going?
Well, it's obviously far less than ideal, David. People are learning. They're getting better. They're adjusting. But we have to keep kids safe. That's first and foremost the most important thing, children and staff and faculty. So nobody wanted to do this. When I led the Chicago Public Schools for 7.5 years, we never missed a day. We never had a snow day. We never had a teacher strike. So trust me, I know how critically important it is to have kids in school, not just for learning, but for safety, for food. But this is where we are, and I think we have to be very honest as we go into the summer and into next school year. That while we definitely want to bring kids back to school and do that as safely as possible, my honest take is that in reality, every child will be spending part of next school year and maybe large parts of next school year continuing to do some virtual learning.
Well, given that we're not likely to have a snapback, as it were, the way it was before, what have we learned that we can improve upon? Where are there particular weaknesses in the system that we've seen so far?
Well, there's so many, frankly, and I think that to start with is just this digital divide. That the idea that children can only learn when they're in a physical school building, 9 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon, just doesn't make any sense today. And children should be able to learn anything they want, anytime, anywhere, and have to have not just devices but access to hotspots and to Wi-Fi. So closing the digital divide so that every child, whether inner city or a rural community or Native American reservation, can find their passion, their genius, and pursue their interests. We've seen so many school districts, doing really thoughtful things. Here in Chicago, they've given out 100,000 devices. In Boston, I think about 30,000. In San Antonio, they have about 49,000 students total. They've given out about 47,000 devices. Places like South Bend, Indiana, they're parking buses that are Wi-Fi enabled in those poor neighborhoods to create that access. So that's one basic place to start with. And then there are places where we can actually be creative, David. And I think this gets a little technical, but it really forces us to think about competency versus seat time. And my point is, do we know that a child knows algebra because they've sat in a class for 4 or 5 days a week for 9 months? Or do we know they know algebra when they know algebra? And that might take 3 months. That might take 9 months. That might take 12 or 15 months. And being able to evaluate kids not by, how much time they spend sitting in class, by what they actually know. That's what we should be doing, educationally anyway. The other thing is that, kids are just really struggling socially and emotionally. And, kids had stress and trauma before, and now this is a whole different level of fear, of concern, of worry, millions of families, people losing their jobs. So not just the educational piece, but the telehealth piece of this, and counselors and social workers and psychologists checking on kids every day. We have to adjust and meet kids where they are.
So, Arne, as you say, there's a digital divide. There has been a substantial inequality in public education in this country long before the pandemic, but this has exacerbated that or put a spotlight on it. Is the biggest problem the access to broadband, and why can't we just fix that? Is it access to the technology and the equipment, or is it actually access to teachers who know how to do this?
Well, I guess all three to varying levels, and this has to be about public-private partnerships. So this has to be private sector and the public sector stepping up together to close this divide once and for all. And this is a terrible time. For everybody, I so wish we weren't here. But if, and it's a big if coming out of this, we have the courage to close that digital divide once and for all, that would be a great thing for kids across the country. So that needs to happen. That must happen now. And if this is the excuse to make that happen, that'd be fantastic. We also, to your point, David, need to do a much better job of training teachers how to teach in this virtual world. And again, that is improving. It's getting better. But clearly that hasn't been a focus of teacher professional development in the past. And now that needs to be the absolute focus. And using this time, between now and the fall to hone those skills, to really help those teachers. Some teachers, I have 2 teenage kids at home. Some of their teachers, this is as easy as could be. They love it. They're fantastic at it. And other teachers, frankly, it's much more of a stretch. And just like we got to meet students where they are on their learning, we got to do the same thing with teachers. Meet them where they are on their learning, but help them improve their skills and their competence to teach in this manner.
The primary responsibility for public education in this country has long been on the shoulders of local school districts such as Chicago, which you ran out there. At the same time, the federal government does have a role. When you were Secretary of Education, you had, I think, $100 billion to distribute. How are we doing as we look at the CARES package? Now we talk about the HEROES Act that Speaker Pelosi is proposing. How are we doing in stepping up at the federal level for support?
Yeah, so I hate to be so somber, but just have to be real honest with you and your listeners that It's hard. It's tough as this time is, David. I'm actually worried it's going to get worse because you just said it perfectly. On the K-12 side, 90% of the funding comes at the state and local level, and only about 10% at the federal level. And as we move into next school year, as sales taxes, as property taxes go down, I'm doing weekly calls with superintendents around the country. They're looking at 15, 20, maybe even 20% budget cuts if there's not help coming from the federal level. And you're exactly right. In 2009, when we had the economic downturn, we put $100 billion through our Recovery Act behind public education, K-12. While I would have loved to have done more, we saved hundreds of thousands of teacher jobs. We didn't save them all. And in the bill that has passed, that was much larger recently, $2.2 trillion. They only put about $20 billion, just a tiny, a paltry sum of money behind K-12 education. And I honestly think, again, this is my personal opinion, that this isn't by accident. It's not a mistake. The current administration isn't that interested in public education and may be happy to see it, starve or suffer. But we need a huge influx of resources. School superintendents are asking for about $250 billion. This is a much tougher time, as we all know, than 2009. And if that doesn't happen, as hard as this is, next school year will look much, much tougher with some very, very devastating budget cuts. And, kids don't deserve that. Families don't deserve it. Right. Teachers don't deserve it. Public education doesn't deserve that. But I'm very concerned about that right now as we speak.
So Arne, as you say, and you know this area so terribly well, this is pretty somber. Leave us perhaps with a little bit of hope. What could come out of this better than it was before? You talked about competency. We all have been on the Khan Academy, for example, that sort of does that. Are there ways, in fact, we could come out of this in a permanent sense, even better off in some respects in public education?
Well, I am always hopeful, and I want to be somber and realistic, but I see what teachers are doing and staff are doing for virtual graduations, and literally saw walking down the street yesterday a car pull up in front of a house with balloons and a diploma, and just to see the joy of that student, his parents, that family. People are doing remarkable things now, and I think that what we're hopefully learning, David, more than anything, is how much we have in common. We're seeing our common humanity, and if we can, take on these really tough issues, take on these what I call opportunity gaps, not achievement gaps. If we can take on the opportunity gaps, if we can close the digital divide, if we can start to meet students where they are, academically, socially, emotionally. Schools are feeding children and their families tens of millions of meals every single day now. I'm doing calls on that every week. It's just remarkable leadership. The human part of this is extraordinary. I don't ever use the term social distancing. I use the term physical distancing because we need to be more connected socially than ever before. And, the relationships, the care, the concern, and the love that teachers and staff and administrators are showing to students now, over the long haul, that's what changes lives, and that's what gives me the most hope.
So, Arne, finally and briefly, is there one example you've seen in a public school system that is actually doing this as well as can be done in a very difficult circumstance?
There are many, and so I hesitate to give you one, but I'll just give you one creative example where in Broward County, my good friend Bob Runcie is the superintendent there. What they're doing is rather than, again, a teacher, let's say teaching just give one concrete example, 5 classes of algebra back-to-back during the day, they're doing one big Zoom class of algebra in the morning, and the teacher's using the rest for all students, and then using the rest of the day to do basically office hours and small group instruction and individual tutoring for students. And so rather than sort of just the repetitive nature of a traditional school day, get that out of the way first thing in the morning, and then again, help meet students where they are individually the rest of the day. That kind of personalized instruction, that personalized attention academically, and again, to kids' food needs, their social and emotional needs, that's the right way to help kids learn and help kids grow and keep them safe.
Yeah, that's the kind of creative innovation that we need all around right now. Thank you so much, Arne. Really appreciate your being with us. That's Arne Duncan. He served as Secretary of Education under President Obama. And coming up on this program, we're going to talk with Danny Meyer, the really legendary restaurateur in New York, about his business and where restaurants are going. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for Stock of the Hour, or maybe Stocks of the Hour. It's the casinos, because they're not doing very well right now, given the tensions with China. And Abigail Doolittle is here with a report. Abigail?
David, we do have these shares sharply lower. Both Las Vegas Sands and Wynn Resorts really underperforming. The overall markets are down just slightly. This, of course, as China looks to be clamping down on Hong Kong, wanting to install new security laws. And what feels a little bit surprising here, even though we have had U.S.-China tensions escalating, some saying that this is a move on the part of China to get back or taunt the U.S., it does seem a little bit surprising in this time of the virus. So essentially, they are going to be installing state security laws. The last round of protests, because of course this is not new. We saw something along this line last year where folks in Hong Kong were very nervous that they would lose freedom of speech, press, and assembly. It shut the central region down for 77 days. Now, of course, Macau, where these casinos are, is tied to Hong Kong by both a bridge and a tunnel. So the fear is that in this time of the virus, when people aren't really doing a lot of trips to the casino anyway, or travel and leisure, that if you have some sort of violent protest erupt, as had happened last year, that it could be bad for those companies. It was certainly bad in the Asian session, David. That Hang Seng in Hong Kong having its worst day going all the way back to 2015, down more than 5%.
The board, but Macau, as I recall, doesn't Wynn specifically get an awful lot of their money out of Macau?
That is correct. About 70% of their revenue by Wynn Resorts does come from the Macau casinos. For Las Vegas Sands, it's a little bit more than 60%. So if you do have protests really shutting down business in those casinos or scaring folks off, on top of the virus, the recession, it could really be a big double whammy. And these stocks, David, to make it even worse, they are among the worst hit by the virus. At the lows, down more than 70%, very similar to the cruise line. So investors, there's been a nice rally in some of these stocks more recently, but at this time, investors perhaps weighing whether or not this is going to be something else to worry about. Overall, down about 40% on the year, David.
Yeah, really eager to open back up the economy, no doubt about it. Thanks so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report on the casinos. Coming up here, we're going to talk with Danny Meyer, among other things, the founder of Shake Shack, about the future of the restaurant industry given the pandemic. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for Bloomberg First Word News, and for that we go to Karina Mitchell.
David, the U.S. has condemned China's plan to impose sweeping national security legislation in Hong Kong. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called the proposal disastrous, and he urged Beijing to reconsider. The legislation would force Hong Kong to implement laws curbing acts of treason, sedition, and subversion. Meanwhile, the U.S. says it wants the World Health Organization to start work now on a planned review of its coordinated international response to the COVID-19 outbreak. The Trump administration has repeatedly criticized the agency and is threatening to cut off U.S. funding. The WHO said this week it would start the review when the time is appropriate. And Americans are fleeing weeks of home isolation for beaches, parks, and other leisure destinations over the Memorial Day weekend, and that has health experts concerned about a spike in coronavirus cases. Memorial Day travel is still expected to be a fraction of previous years. The U.S. Travel Association anticipates consumers will spend just $4.2 billion on travel over the holiday weekend, a third of 2019 levels. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Karina Mitchell. This is Bloomberg. David.
Thank you so much, Karina. Well, at the tender young age of 27, Danny Meyer founded the Union Square Cafe, and then he went on to start more than 20 widely acclaimed restaurants all around the New York area, and that's not to mention having founded Shake Shack, which ultimately he took public. So we welcome now Danny Meyer, acclaimed restaurateur, to Bloomberg. Thank you, Danny, for being here. Give us your sense of where the restaurant industry is in the New York area and more broadly.
Hi, David. I think to answer the question, we have to just acknowledge that the restaurant industry is not monolithic. So there are all kinds of different kinds of restaurants. I think that the full service restaurant segment is going to probably have the toughest time coming back. And that's where most, but not all of our restaurants lie. I think the fast casual, fine casual restaurant segment is going to come back well sooner because those are businesses that didn't necessarily rely on how many people were sitting in the dining room at the same time. They've had a pretty robust takeout and pickup and delivery model coming into this. So that's a really good segment. So we'll see how it all goes.
So what does that mean for your operation? Because you're really known for a lot for high-end restaurants, which you go into and you eat. You do not take out so much, although you do have some of the latter as well. As you look forward to opening back up, what does that tell you about how you're going to open up?
I think what we're all going to see in the full service business is that for some period of time, and we don't really know how long it's going to last, the only way to recover any kind of revenue is going to be to bring people back to work safely. And what that means is that in a kitchen, which is not designed for people to be working, 6 feet apart from one another, you're going to see way fewer menu items. You're going to see fewer hours of operation because you can't bring in a whole bunch of different people, a whole bunch of different crews working cheek to jowl the way we used to. And you're probably going to see businesses that are finding entrepreneurial ways to cook really good food and to share that food, but not by welcoming people into their restaurants. So you'll see curbside pickup, lots of delivery. You'll see lots of businesses doing things that you never would have expected, turning their restaurants into a wine store, turning their restaurants into a type of grocery store where the regulars at the restaurant trust the way that restaurant purchases produce and fish and meats and cheese and wants to actually reduce their number of trips to the grocery store, but wants to have a restaurant that they can trust either providing grocery kits, meal kits, or maybe even the finished product.
So what does it mean in the meantime? We hear stories about going in and having waiters in masks and maybe having plexiglass between tables, not having nearly as many tables. Is that sustainable for the restaurant industry? You were widely quoted as saying, I'm not sure we can really reopen until a vaccine comes. I'm not sure that was exactly in context, but do we need to wait till there's a vaccine before we can really go back to restaurant, eating, dining?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be about. I don't think it's going to be about waiting till a vaccine. I think that it's going to be waiting till the public at large develops a kind of demand that says we read the news just like everybody reads the news. We read scientific reports, and when the public at large collectively feels a sense of confidence about going out and dining in restaurants, that's when you're going to see things start to happen. And I think in the meantime, it's going to be tough, David, because restaurants, the way the restaurant economy works, it's been pretty hard with decreasing margins for many years to make money anything less than I'd say about 80% occupancy. So if to make it safe to bring people into our restaurants, we're looking at 50 or 40 or 30% occupancy. I just don't really know how restaurants can do that for very much time. I think what we're going to wait for is not necessarily. I'm sorry, somebody's keeps calling me, and I'm trying to figure out.
We're all having this experience, Danny, wherever we are. Believe me, we're familiar with it.
Yeah. At least we don't have a dog barking in the background right now. That's the other thing that I'm hearing about from everybody. But what I was going to say is this. A vaccine will be nice. I do believe that there are many steps that can create that type of consumer demand and safety before that. For example, if we find that we're going to have some type of remedy so that if people really believed, seeing all the data, that if I were to get the virus, I've taken all the precautions I know how to take, masks, distancing, washing my hands, and yet if I still were to get the virus, there's a remedy out there that would make me feel even that my low odds of mortality or fatality are even lower. That's the kind of mid-step. I think other mid-steps that restaurants can employ, and we'll all be looking for these because we don't know when there's going to be a vaccine. So we'll be looking for things like, what's the role that testing can play? What's the role that testing can play for our own staff to feel comfortable coming in? What's the role that testing of our own staff is going to play in terms of you as a consumer feeling more comfortable coming in? And I just think that every little thing we do can actually mean a lot. But I just don't want to give undue hope, because until we get to the point where restaurants can actually have enough business, and let's not forget that bar business is a big part of what makes even an 80% capacity in a restaurant work. We can sell cocktails out the door, but let's face it, that's a whole lot different than what we used to have, which was a full bar with another layer of people waiting for their table. So look, we're going to get to the other side of this. This too shall pass, but it's probably going to be many, many, many weeks before we get to that phase of thriving again, like restaurants once did. And in the meantime, this is tapping one of the best parts of being in this business. Nobody got into this industry because it was an easy buck. We got into this business because we love taking care of people, and because we're entrepreneurs who always find another way. And we're going to find some really interesting new revenue models right now where we can provide our hospitality to you even when you're not in our restaurant. And if we're really lucky, some of those methods and business scenarios will actually endure and help our industry even after we get back to serving you inside the restaurant.
Will those new ways involve as many people? Because you at Union Square Hospitality Group have always been focused on your people, on your employees. So many people lost their jobs all across the country in restaurants. Are we looking at a world where maybe the entire industry will employ fewer people?
I think in the near term, absolutely, because there's no way that we're going to go from 0 to 100 overnight. And we've been as transparent as we possibly can with our team. We have a weekly call with everybody who's part of the Union Square Hospitality Group family. Many, many of them, sadly, are not employed today by USHG, but we're staying in contact because we want to get to that, to that point as soon as we possibly can of being able to employ all of the people who either choose to move back to New York. Many of them, frankly, David, have left New York City and are rationally asking themselves, do I want to go back there? Well, we hope that they will. We hope that there will be a point when we get back to full employment. But it would be disingenuous to say that, in July or August or September or October, we're going to go from 0 back up to 100. And we're going to build the business, hopefully, with consumer demand. And I'll get back to what I said to you earlier. Consumers are going to have a whole lot to do with this. I cannot tell anyone that they should feel safe sooner than they want to feel safe. And let me a quick analogy. After 9/11, we already had the technology of metal detectors. We just hadn't deployed it everywhere. But it took metal detectors to make an average person feels safe getting on an airplane again. That said, I was willing and able to fly probably within 3 weeks of 9/11 for a business trip. It took my wife, Audrey, probably a year, maybe a year and a half before she felt comfortable doing that. And I feel like it's the same thing. She wasn't wrong and I wasn't right, but I think that different people are going to feel differently. Now, one thing about this pandemic is that the statistics obviously show here that in terms of mortality, younger people have had a much lower rate than older people. And it may be that unlike flying, we might be able to see generations feeling more comfortable coming back more quickly to dining in restaurants. And we're open, but it's going to be that demand that is going to make us really know when we can do this. The other thing I would add just quickly is that in our case, a lot of our restaurants are actually connected to other activities. So for example, we're in art museums or ballparks or hotels. And so we're going to take our cues in a lot of those cases from those organizations as well.
We're talking with Danny Meyer. He's the head of the Union Square Hospitality Group about the restaurant industry. But let me understand what you're saying, because it is obviously a question of whether people are confident to come back, not just whether they can come back. We've talked to people in other sectors who say exactly the same thing. Are you saying really we have to wait for the science as a practical matter, that there's not that much, we don't have the equivalent of the metal detector for TSA to really make me feel comfortable going back into the restaurant?
As of this minute, I don't know of a virus detector. We will absolutely be employing everything we can. It could be a thermometer, and that may give you some sense of comfort. It may be testing our employees. There might even be, the kind of things I'm starting to hear about are things like health passports, where when you show up at the restaurant using a QR code or some other means that could potentially connect to our reservation system, you can let us know that you're healthy. And that would then make everybody else in the dining room feel more healthy. Listen, this is a two-way street. It starts with our staff. It's got to feel safe for our staff to come to work. That involves everything from public transportation feeling safe. It also involves for our staff, if we're going to be serving you, our staff wants to know that you're healthy, because let's just face it, the restaurant business is one of a lot of human contact. I do not know how to pour a bottle of wine from 6 feet away. Maybe what that means is you're not going to have sommeliers pouring your wine from now on, or at least for the near term. We'll be adjusting any way we can so that we can get back open just as soon as we can.
Okay, Danny, thank you so very much. I'm delighted to say Danny Meyer will be staying with us for the second hour of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio. And coming up here, we're going to hear from Nancy Pelosi about what she thinks about this contretemps with China. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, there's a showdown brewing in Washington, and this time it's not the Republicans against the Democrats. It's actually perhaps both of them confronting China over their crackdown over on Hong Kong, something we talked with Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, about just yesterday.
This is something we just learned of. It passed with unanimous consent, so there wasn't much debate or we don't know who voted. It was unanimous consent. So we'll review it in the House. I've asked my committees to take a look at what that is. I take second place to no one in the Congress, House or Senate, and my criticisms of China's trade policies vis-a-vis the United States over decades, their human rights policies, their proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Right now, whether it's the Uyghurs, the people of Hong Kong, Tibet, you name it, they have been very oppressive and even more so. But the fact is that we have to judge we have to have a relationship with China, and we judge every action as to what it means to us as well as what it means to them. So I look forward to seeing that. It's interesting that it had such unanimous support, though, in the Senate.
Madam Speaker, I do want to ask about the Inspector General issue. We know that the President of the United States dismissed the State Department Inspector General, apparently at the request of Secretary Pompeo. You've expressed some objection to that. Was it within the President's rights to dismiss him?
Well, the President can fire any federal employee within his range. I mean, there's some who are protected, but he has a right to fire him. But it is also essential for him to tell the American people and the Congress of the United States why. Why? Because these inspectors general were instituted following Watergate. Their purpose was to be watchdogs as to behavior, whether it's waste, fraud, abuse, or any other abuse of power that some in the agencies might engage in. This is a protection for the American people, and they are respected throughout the decades since then. So this is a demonstration of a power, of the fear that this administration has of the truth. These inspectors general are, by and large, apolitical. Some have served both parties, both presidents from one to the next. So it's not anything partisan about it. And every business, as you know, in the private sector, you have compliance officers, in the press, you have ombudsmen, and here we have inspectors general. Again, they're afraid of the truth that these inspector generals, and it's a pattern. This is a pattern of firing inspectors general. It's just wrong. It's scandalous, really, and we want to know why.
Well, exactly. That's the question of why, and there have been conflicting reports I've read, at least in the press, about why. I believe you've asked for Secretary Pompeo actually to come up and testify in front of Congress. Are you confident you can get him to come up and explain to you what happened?
Well, the administration, again, is afraid of the truth, so they have sort of muzzled many of their people who have a responsibility to report to Congress. But that doesn't mean that we're not asking for him to come up and actually for Congress to exercise its oversight responsibilities over policy. Now, there have been talk about personal errands and this or that, and there have been talk about use of federal funds to entertain that might accrue to his political advantage. I'm very concerned about the fact that this inspector general may have been looking into the false emergency that was declared by the administration in terms of arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Somehow or other, Saudi Arabia and Russia, they seem to be the pet countries of the president. He always wants to do something extraordinary for them.
That was Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi speaking with us here on Balance of Power just yesterday. And a program note now, at 6 p.m. Eastern Time this evening, we're going to have the latest edition of Wall Street Week. This week we will be joined by Larry Summers of Harvard, as well as Gillian Tett of the Financial Times. Among other things, we're going to talk about the issue we just talked with Danny Meyer about, which is the willingness of the consumer to come back into the marketplace. Are they going to have the confidence in their own safety to resume in the market? That's going to be Wall Street Week tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. And this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, let's get into the long holiday weekend by starting with a market check. And for that, we go to Abigail Doolittle. So, Abigail, the stocks actually come off their lows, as I understand it. They're not reacting to China as much as I thought they might.
They're really not. It's pretty interesting here, David, because there's actually a divergence between the reaction around this China news. So, of course, overnight, China cracking down on Hong Kong. More recently, the U.S. Warning China that this is not a good idea. So really an example or a proxy for the tensions between the rising tensions, once again rising tensions, between the U.S. and China. So you would think that that would hit U.S. stocks similar to yesterday. But right now we have very tiny moves. The S&P 500 down 0.1%. The tech-heavy NASDAQ actually up 1%. So that tells you that investors may not be concerned overall about rising U.S.-China tensions. Where we do have concern, though, there's a China index, the Golden Dragon China Index, down for a third day in a row, down 3.4% today. This is filled with Chinese firms listed here in the U.S. So, of course, you were just sharing that conversation with Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi from yesterday, talking about that bill passed by the Senate to delist foreign companies, presumably targeting to some degree some of these Chinese firms. Investors taking that very seriously with that index down so sharply. It is a little bit, though, of a risk-off tone, even though U.S. stocks are mainly flat, with bonds just a little bit higher, David.
And what about commodities? I also want to check in on commodities. What about oil, for example? With news coming out of China, it often affects oil.
That's a great point, David. I actually had not thought of that myself, but you're absolutely right. And copper is down, too. So oil into today had been up 6 days in a row, the longest winning streak since February. Oil today down sharply, down 5% earlier, now down about 3%. So the commodity index is off of its lows. Copper also lower. So that, again, is a great point on your part, because China, of course, is the world's largest user of natural resources. So those commodity traders getting out of that portion of the risk asset trade.
But I always am a little bit chary about interpreting the markets just as we go into a long holiday weekend, because people may be positioning themselves, you know. Some of the moves may be just because it's a weekend.
Well, you certainly have to be worried to some degree about headline risk because who knows what could come out over the next 3 days. So sometimes into the close, you could see some sort of selling. However, on the week, David, it is an up week for the S&P 500, up more than 2%, and most sectors are actually higher on the week. And some of the important cyclical sectors are higher on the week, too, which is very constructive. The financials, the industrials, along with consumer discretionary. I know that you've been having lots of conversations about whether or not the consumer is coming back. That sector having a very nice week, so maybe that's a positive sign.
And as you say, it's been choppy. Thanks so much to Abigail Doolittle, and have a great weekend. Coming up in the next hour on Bloomberg Balance of Power on radio, President Trump has just said he's going to have a news conference at the White House. It is Memorial Day weekend, and also there has been a back and forth with China today. So we'll see what the president has to tell us. That does it for today, and this is Bloomberg.